In the north of Iraq, 5 peoples live in the same towns. They use the same markets. A team of geneticists sampled 500 men across all 5, reading the same 17 points on the Y chromosome in each one. 4 of the 5 came back looking like neighbours, overlapping, blurred at the edges the way people always are when they have lived beside each other for centuries. The 5th did not. They are the Christians of the plain of Nineveh, and they call themselves Syriacs. Their men sat apart from every single group around them, not a little apart by a measure that held against population after population, including people whose grandparents had been their grandparents' neighbours. Then the researchers turned the question around. Instead of asking how different these men were from everyone else, they asked how different they were from each other. That number came back the lowest in the entire study. The word the paper uses is bottleneck. Something narrowed these men down to a very small number of fathers, and whatever it was, it did not touch the 4 peoples living in the same towns. A result like that has an obvious first explanation, and it is worth killing early. Isolation usually means geography. A mountain, an island, a valley with one road in. Populations go strange when the land makes them strange and the map does the explaining for you. That is not available here. These people were not on an island. They were on a plain in towns in the middle of everyone. So the researchers did the natural thing and asked which population the Syriacs were close to. If they were far from all their neighbours, someone somewhere had to be their match. There was exactly one group in the region they were not significantly distant from. The Yazidis. Take a moment with that, because it is the strangest sentence in the study. The Yazidis are not their co-religionists. The Syriacs are Christian, the Yazidis are not. They do not share a liturgy or a priesthood or a holy book or a history of alliance. They are not each other's linguistic relatives in any close sense. What they share is one thing only. Both of them are communities you cannot marry into. 2 peoples who kept their doors shut, sitting closer to one another in the data than either sits to the neighbours they have shared a plane with for 2,500 years. Not because they were mixing with each other, because they were both refusing, separately, in parallel for a very long time, to mix with anybody. The isolation is real. It just is not made of rock. The paper says it plainly. The unusually low variety in these 2 groups is, in its own words, perhaps a reflection of well-documented isolation and strict religious endogamy. Endogamy is a dry word for something ordinary and enormous. It means you marry inside. It means the question of who your children's other parent may be was answered before you were born, and answered the same way for your parents and theirs. Do that for a few generations and nothing happens. Do it for 50 and the arithmetic starts to show. Every generation, the pool of possible fathers narrows slightly. Lines die out and are not replaced from outside. The men who remain are increasingly each other's cousins at a remove too far back for anyone to feel. Nobody in that community ever experienced this. There was no year it happened. There is no event to point at. It is the sum of a rule applied quietly by people who are not thinking about genetics. And it produces something a mountain range cannot, a population that is genetically closed while being physically completely open. They were in the market every day. They were simply not in the marriages. One study is one study. The obvious way this finding falls apart is if it turns out to be a quirk of those particular 86 men, or of that laboratory, or of that stretch of chromosome. So it matters that it is not the only place this has shown up. A separate group working in Iran on Assyrians who had been outside Iraq for generations looked for how closed the community was and concluded that it was closed. Their measure of mixing came back high for endogamy, and they linked it to religious and cultural tradition, producing very little intermixture with the populations around them. That study was small, and it rested on a single stretch of DNA, which is much thinner evidence than 17 markers across 500 men. It is corroboration, not proof, and it should be carried that way. A third team, also in Iran, compared Assyrian men against Armenians, Zoroastrians, and 3 Iranian Muslim populations. They found the Assyrians sitting close to the Armenians, another ancient Christian community with its own long habit of marrying inside. And when they came to explain a particular lineage showing up in Assyrian men, they offered 3 possible causes and refused to choose between them. One of the 3 was drift in a small, closed population. Different countries, different laboratories, different pieces of the genome. Nobody checking anybody else's work. They keep arriving at the same property. This is an old, closed population, which raises the only question that actually matters, and the one the genetics cannot answer. Everything so far describes a group of people. It does not tell you who they are. These communities call themselves Assyrians. They name themselves after the empire whose capital, Nineveh, sits in ruins a short drive from where those samples were taken. It is on their flags and in their churches and in the name of the language they speak at home. And a serious body of scholarship says that claim does not hold. Sebastian Brock, one of the most respected scholars of Syriac in the world, has written that the alleged ethnic identity with the ancient Assyrians is in fact a recent creation, one that took place over the last century and a half, and that it lacks any sound historical basis. Adam Becker has argued that the use of the word Assyrian for the modern community derives from Western sources, not from a continuity of identity between the ancient Assyrians and the modern ones. John Joseph devoted a book to the argument that the modern Assyrian national identity was shaped in large part by encounters with Western Christian missionaries, archaeologists, and colonial powers in the 19th century. That is a real case made by people who read the sources in the original languages, and it deserves to be stated at full strength rather than waved at. The shape of it is this. Europeans dug up Nineveh in the 1840s. The discovery was a sensation. Missionaries were already working among the local Christians, and a name that had been out of use as a national label came back into circulation attached to a living people. On that account, the continuity is something the West handed them. The other side of the argument is not empty. The self-name itself has a chain. The Akkadian word for an Assyrian is generally accepted to be the root of the Syriac term these communities use for themselves today. Their language is not just Aramaic, but a specifically Eastern Aramaic, carrying grammatical structure inherited from Akkadian, the language of the empire. And the identity demonstrably did not stop when the empire did. In the generations after the fall, there are cuneiform records written by people with Assyrian names in Assyrian style by officials with Assyrian titles invoking Ashur, the Assyrian national god. Under Persian rule, people with clearly Assyrian names turn up at high levels of government. The Temple of Ashur was rebuilt by local Assyrians during the reign of Cyrus the Great. Centuries later, still, in the Parthian period, people in that region were naming their children things like Kib-Assor and Assortes, names with the god of a dead empire built into them. Medieval Syriac writers, including Jacob of Edessa and Michael the Syrian, connected their own communities to Assyrian ancestry long before any European archaeologist arrived. So where does that leave it? Honestly, unresolved and unresolved on purpose, because the two sides are not arguing about the same thing. Nobody serious disputes that there were people who called themselves Assyrians for centuries after the empire fell. What is disputed is whether the line from those people to a man giving a cheek swab in Nineveh province today is a continuous ethnic identity or a modern reconstruction of one. And here is the part that matters for this video. The genetics does not vote in that argument. What the DNA shows is an old, closed, distinct population in a specific place. It cannot attach a name from an empire to a living person because a name is not a thing that lives in a genome. It is worth being exact about what fell because the thing these people are accused of inventing a link to was very real. Nineveh was taken by a combined Babylonian and Median force, and the Assyrian king died in the city. The empire did not end there. A successor, Ashur-uballit II, withdrew west to Haran and held what was left for 3 more years. Haran fell too. He ran for Carchemish, and after that the record simply loses him. Nobody knows whether he died in the second fight at Haran or in the last one 4 years later. There is no tomb, no account of his death, no final scene. The last king of the largest state the world had yet built walks off the edge of the evidence. That is the end of Assyria as a state. 609 years before the Common Era. Everything in this video that comes after that point is people, not government. No army, no capital, no king. Whatever survived had to survive without any of the machinery that normally carries an identity forward. 2,600 years is a difficult number to hold. It is longer than the gap between us and the Roman Republic, doubled and then some. Empires that rose and fell entirely inside that window include Rome itself, Byzantium, the Caliphates, the Mongols, the Ottomans, and the British. The state was gone before any of them started. Here is the clearest thing that did survive. Akkadian, the language of the Assyrian court, died. It was replaced gradually by Aramaic, which had become the working language of the whole region. That Aramaic is still spoken. Not in a liturgy, not by scholars, not as a revival. Spoken at home, to children, as a first language, by people alive right now. The Eastern dialects the Assyrians use carry structure inherited from Akkadian inside them, which means the grammar of the empire is still moving through living mouths. How many mouths is genuinely unclear, and the sources disagree enough that it would be dishonest to give you one figure. One recent estimate puts native speakers near 940,000. Ethnologue lists closer to 600,000. UNESCO works from a figure nearer 500,000. Somewhere in that spread is the truth. What the sources do not disagree about is the direction. UNESCO classifies the language as definitely endangered. The reason is not persecution, at least not primarily. It is emigration and acculturation. Children raised in Chicago and Sydney and Stockholm are acquiring less of it than their parents did. A language that outlived Nineveh by 26 centuries is being lost in 1 or 2 generations to ordinary life in safe countries. There is an obvious way to settle the argument in Chapter 5, and it is worth explaining why nobody has done it. You would take DNA from the Assyrian imperial period, from a grave inside the empire, from someone who lived under those kings. Then you would compare it to the men in the study and see whether the line holds. That comparison has never been made because the first half of it does not exist. No ancient genome has been published from the Assyrian imperial period. Not one. The oldest Mesopotamian DNA that has been published comes from a site on the upper Tigris called Kaonu. 13 people buried between roughly 8,500 and 7,500 years before the Common Era. That is not close. That is 6,000 years before the empire. Those people are as distant from an Assyrian king as an Assyrian king is from us twice over. They are a different story entirely. The reason for the gap is not neglect. It is heat. DNA breaks down faster in warm, dry conditions, and ancient DNA as a field has been overwhelmingly successful in cold and temperate places and overwhelmingly frustrated in hot ones. The same problem has held back the Levant. It has held back South Asia. Mesopotamia sits squarely in the difficult zone. So the question of whether these people are those people has a laboratory answer waiting for it, and the sample is still in the ground in a country where the last 40 years have not been kind to archaeology. There is one more piece of the genetics, and it is the piece that changes what all of this is for. North of the plain, in what is now southeastern Turkey, there is a range called the Hakkari. It was a Syrian country. Before the First World War, the population there is believed to have exceeded 150,000 people spread across 280 villages. During that war, the Assyrian communities of southeastern Anatolia and northwestern Persia were killed and driven out alongside the Armenians and the Greeks. They call it Sipho, the sword. The number of dead is genuinely disputed, and there is no census that can settle it. Contemporary estimates run between 100,000 and 200,000. Other sources put it around 250,000. Some contemporary reports went as high as 270,000. The International Association of Genocide Scholars formally recognized it in 2007. The villages did not recover. The people who lived did not go back, which creates a problem for anyone who wants to know what the genetics of the Hakkari looked like. You cannot go there and take samples. There is no population left to sample, so a study was done the only way it could be. 70 people in the diaspora scattered across other continents. Every one of them able to name the village their mother's line came from. Between them, they covered 21 of the major Assyrian settlements of the Hakkari, as those settlements existed before the killing. Their maternal lineages came back entirely West Eurasian, with a striking concentration of one particular haplogroup and a signature that distinguishes the Highlanders from Assyrians elsewhere in Iran and Iraq. The mountains had their own genetic character, and it is still legible. Understand what that means. That is a genetic map of a homeland assembled out of the descendants of the people who fled it. The information about the place is not in the place. It is in the people who left, and it is only there because they kept track of which village they came from. This is what the whole video has been walking toward, and it is not a story about DNA proving anybody's claim. A rule about marriage kept a population closed for a very long time, and that closure is why they are still distinguishable at all. The same rule that made them a genetic curiosity is the reason there is anything left to study. Had they blurred into their neighbours the way the 4 other groups in that first study blurred into each other, there would be no signal, no bottleneck, no distance, no Hakkari map to reconstruct. They would have been absorbed, and absorption leaves no evidence of itself. Their empire lasted about 3 centuries at its height and has been gone for 26. They are still here, still arguing with scholars about their own name, still speaking a grammar that belonged to a dead court, and still carrying, in the least romantic and most literal way available, a record of exactly which mountain village they came from. Not because anything protected them, because they closed the door and kept it closed for longer than most nations have existed.